representing the rich multicultural community of Tampa Bay. Established in 2023, the Tampa Lector Consortium mission is to promote reading, writing, and literature among adults and children in the community. This inaugural event will honor the lector tradition, cigar workers, and
Empezamos.
all right. So let's begin. To continue our presentation tonight, I would like to introduce to you the distinguished panel, Professor and Writer-Editor Gabriel Cataya, Dr. Kenya Dorwin Mendez, and of course, the one and only Honorable Judge E.J. Salcines.
Primera Feria Internacional del Libro en Tampa, y es un enorme orgullo que todos ustedes, los que nos acompañan esta noche, sean testigos de este acontecimiento que con los años pudiera ser histórico. Las primeras palabras en español porque es el idioma con que se fundó Iborosí. Esta noche no es para la presentación de libros, pero hacemos una excepción, una deferencia a uno de los más grandes escritores hispanoamericanos, al que consideramos un invitado de honor. Al presentar un libro suyo, le damos presencia en esta sala y durante todo el evento. Porque es un escritor que cuando llegó a Tampa por primera vez, invitado a una velada artístico-literaria, trajo consigo un pequeño libro que hemos reeditado para esta ocasión. Un libro de poemas dedicado a su pequeño hijo, en cuya primera página confesó su fe en el mejoramiento humano y en la utilidad de la virtud. Claro, hablamos de José Martí y de su poemario Ismaelillo, inscrito por la crítica literaria entre las letras fundadoras del modernismo. Como sabemos, Martí llegó al andén de Iborosí a pocas cuadras de aquí en la primera hora del 26 de noviembre de 1891. La velada artístico-literaria de aquel anochecer se convirtió en el amanecer de la independencia de Cuba. Allí se prometió fundar una república cuya primera ley fuera, de verdad, el culto de cada cubano a la dignidad plena del hombre. Porque la dignidad plena del hombre entraña, primeramente, el derecho a la libertad no solo de un pueblo, sino de la persona, al trabajo como fuente de progreso, la sensibilidad hacia todos los seres humanos, al límite de sentir en la mejilla el golpe que reciba cualquier mejilla de hombre, más allá del color de la piel, del rango social, de la ideología, de la elección política o religiosa. Imaginario que echó raíces en el alma cubana desde aquel discurso de aquella noche a 2 minutos de esta sala, cuando dijo con todos y para el bien de todos, y donde 18 veces se pronunció la palabra libertad, y que 133 años después sigue siendo un sueño irrealizado. En aquella velada artístico-literaria también hubo versos, canciones, añoranza de patria y compromiso de conquistarla. Fueron solo 3 días los que en aquella primera visita estuvo Martí en Tampa, el mismo tiempo que debe durar esta Feria del Libro. Él dejó su Ismaelillo en manos de Eligio Carbonell. Ustedes dejarán sus libros en manos de habitantes de Tampa, procedentes de diversos orígenes, y serán libros útiles, como lo fue y lo es aquel. El Ismaelillo de Martí, dedicado a su hijo, ha tenido decenas de ediciones, casi todas en Cuba, aunque algunas en el extranjero. Pero en Tampa, que fue tan significativa para él y donde él mismo lo trajo, no se había editado. Por ello pensamos útil hacerlo ahora, en el marco de nuestra primera Feria Internacional del Libro, y mostrarlo en este momento inaugural en la ciudad que él llamó Tampa Fiel. Porque esta es una noche de gratitud, se hace esta excepción con un escritor mayor de nuestra América, al presentar un libro que le da presencia en esta sala y en todo el evento de 3 días. Algunos de los escritores que están hoy aquí y han traído su libro vienen a Tampa por primera vez, pero seguramente la mayoría conoce este poemario y tal vez alguno de los presentes ha escrito sobre él. Cuando Martí trajo su Ismaelillo, también vino por primera vez, sin saber entonces que con aquel pequeño libro se estaba abriendo el camino, como con tanta prosa poética suya, a la fundación de un nuevo género literario. También sabía que aquel día en Tampa, tampoco sabía que aquel día en Tampa encontraría el lugar idóneo en el que nacería el Partido Revolucionario Cubano, en el que se consolida su liderazgo político. Después vino otras 20 veces y esperamos que muchos de nuestros visitantes superen esta cifra. En esta edición de Ismaelillo que presentamos, creímos útil un breve preámbulo que relacione al libro con Tampa y unas notas finales para los lectores no informados sobre el destino de aquel niño a quien se le dedicó uno de los poemarios más hermosos que un padre haya escrito a su hijo ausente. Por ello, junto a varias fotografías de José Francisco Martí Sayas Bazán, el hijo, se ofrecen datos biográficos suyos para que al leer ese Ismaelillo sepamos cuál fue la vida adulta de aquel niño al que su padre llamó caballero, reyecillo, príncipe. Después de todo, leer una y otra vez Ismaelillo, además del disfrute estético que produce siempre la buena poesía, y a este evento llega muy buena poesía, es también sentir a Martí entre nosotros, entonando un canto eterno a la libertad y al amor que tanta falta nos hacen. Nuestro amigo, el honorable juez Emiliano Salcines, va a hablar sobre el lector de tabaquería, a quien se dedica esta Feria del Libro por la significación que tiene en la historia de la ciudad. Y este pequeño libro también se vincula a ellos, porque Eligio Carbonell, a quien en la dedicatoria Martí llamó el mejor de los hijos, también fue lector, como su padre Néstor, quien fundó la primera librería de Ybor City y donde los lectores iban a buscar los libros. Por eso anoto en el preámbulo de Ismaelillo que ese libro debió leerse no solo por Eligio, sino que seguramente algún lector de tabaquería lo llevó consigo al taller, y entre el humo del tabaco y los sueños forjados con el discurso de su autor hacia una patria con todos y para el bien de todos, debió enriquecer la sala llena de padres recitando el hermoso príncipe enano, mi caballero, musa traviesa. En fin, tan profunda como la añoranza del padre por su hijo ausente era la que ellos sentían por las palmas que esperan, identificadas ambas, paternidad patria, en el mejor discurso expresado en Tampa, donde ahora se edita por primera vez el Ismaelillo de José Martí, nuestro Ismaelillo. Martí confesó al hijo que este poemario era una fiesta poética para él, y esta Feria del Libro es una fiesta literaria que se hace para todos ustedes. Muchas gracias. Un dato antes de ceder la palabra: el libro Ismaelillo es una edición realmente de lujo, con fotografías, etcétera. Lo pueden adquirir en la Feria del Libro, solo, y ahora se habla de dinero, por 10 pesos, eso se ve mal cuando se habla de poesía, pero sería como donación a la Feria del Libro, nunca para quien preparó el libro, porque Martí trajo el libro de regalo a Tampa, no lo vendió a los amigos.
De lay upon us tomorrow, which will be celebrated tomorrow as well. I'm going to talk to you about a woman that maybe many of you have not heard of. Her name is Luisa Capetillo, who was born and raised in Puerto Rico. And the reason I'm talking about her here tonight is because she actually spent time in Ybor City as an activist and organizer of cigar workers, but she also was a lector at a factory, and in fact, possibly the only woman reader at a factory here in Ybor City. We haven't found out what factory yet, but it was likely in Ybor City as she boarded in Ybor City. So I call her a woman for all times. On July 1st of 1912, a newspaper in Richmond, Virginia, a progressive newspaper, published a photograph of a woman wearing bulky trousers and a long coat, and the title of the article was "Trouserettes are the latest in Gotham." The article talked about a certain Puerto Rican woman whose fashion was all the rage in the streets of New York City. I could identify with that, I'm from New York. Luisa Capetillo, the young writer and member of a prominent family in Puerto Rico, as they used to call it then, photographed in this picture is what appeared on the front page. And I know it's not big, but this is hardly revealing by today's standards. Hardly. Okay, but women weren't allowed to wear pants. In fact, she was arrested in Havana, Cuba for wearing trousers. What would they do today? I don't know. It was a very dainty lace coat with linen, full length, and it fully draped over these striking boomers, which is what these big trousers were called, and they reached about an inch or two above her ankle. Very, very risque. Miss Capetillo's costume attracted so much attention that the busy avenue, this is New York, Fifth Avenue, was congested with thousands of people and scores of automobiles and other vehicles, and matters became so bad that a policeman requested for her to pin her coat down as far as at least the knees, which she actually did. So she didn't get arrested in New York. What that text doesn't mention about Luisa Capetillo is that she was a Puerto Rican feminist, anarchist, journalist, and labor union leader who was temporarily in New York working with the Hispanic communities there, especially the tobacco workers and the labor leaders. Remembered by many in Puerto Rico as the first woman to wear pantalones, pants, in public, Capetillo was far from a fashion icon. She was a pioneer in addressing the problems facing the working class, the condition of women and children, and the importance of labor organizing on the island. She was born in October 28, 1879 in Arecibo, Puerto Rico, which boasted one of the most important ports on the island, or in the island, and enjoyed a high level of sugarcane production as well, and was the center of radical workers' culture in Puerto Rico. Capetillo lived through some of the most important political and economic transitions in Puerto Rico. For example, the end of the Spanish-American War, at which point Puerto Rico became a U.S. territory, which it still is. And that was something that Spain ceded to the U.S. When they signed the Treaty of Paris. Her father belonged to a middle class of recently arrived Spanish men, and her mother was a housemaid who hailed from France. So it's odd that she's identified as the daughter of a prominent family, as the note in the Richmond newspaper says. Nevertheless, her parents did stimulate her intellectual curiosity and instilled in her a commitment to the working class and to the oppressed. Her early education was influenced by the writings of many of the authors that were read in the factories here. Gustave Flaubert, Émile Zola, Sand, and also political theorists like Peter Kropotkin and George Soros and Enrico Malatesta and even Leo Tolstoy. They shaped her political views on the meaning of religion, anarchism, and social justice. But a lot of her formation also took place in the field, so to speak, because she worked as a seamstress to support her young children and was also a lectora in the tobacco factories in Puerto Rico, where she read national and international newspapers and novels for the men and women who worked as leaf strippers and cigar rollers. Her role as a lectora in the factory was key in her development as a workers' leader. The tobacco factory was an important cultural space where the workers, artesanos, artisans, many with anarchist tendencies, received an alternative education, perhaps the only education they had. And they became working class intellectuals, what in Spanish we call intelectuales orgánicos. She was also a member and leader of the oldest, or one of the oldest workers' unions in Puerto Rico, the Federación Libre de Trabajadores, and responsible for many of the strikes that took place at the beginning of the 20th century with the sugarcane workers in 1905, and this is where she made her debut as a public orator. So she worked tirelessly as a journalist and union organizer and began that work in 1905. But in addition to publishing her work in local newspapers and editing a short-lived working-class women's magazine called La Mujer, The Woman, Capetillo authored several books of essays and plays, beginning with Ensayos Libertarios in 1907, La Humanidad en el Futuro in 1910, Mi Opinión in 1911, and Influencias de las Ideas Modernas in 1916. In Ensayos Libertarios, she expresses her anti-clerical views. They're very evident. She believed organized religion was particularly oppressive to women. She also wrote about key things that were key to her political views and guiding principles in her personal life. For example, she believed in the return to nature. She was a vegetarian. She believed in free love. She never married the father of her 3 children. Universal fraternity, and the importance of workers' unions. She became the first Puerto Rican woman to publish a feminist thesis, Mi opinión sobre las libertades, derechos y deberes de la mujer. My opinion on the freedoms, rights, and duties of women, which challenged societal norms and advocated for equal education for all. Like other intellectuals and worker organizers at the turn of the century, she traveled outside of Puerto Rico to New York, to Tampa, to La Habana, and to the Dominican Republic, where she participated in political rallies and strikes. Following in the steps of Cuban intellectual and politician José Martí, she traveled to Ybor City and Tampa, where she worked with Cuban, Italian, African American, and Spanish cigar workers who had moved to the region during the late 19th century. And thanks to a good friend, I discovered that she lived here in 1914 and was identified as a news correspondent here and boarded at 1808 Lamar Avenue, not too far from here, near what is the Centro Estudiano spot and right next to the Road of Shalom synagogue, the first one. And she also worked at a cigar factory as a reader, but we don't know yet. So during these travels, she caught the eye of the local press, and the press was intrigued by her clothes, but they did little to inquire about the woman and all that she did. She recruited women for her female army, and in 1915, while in Cuba and participating in a sugarcane workers' strike, she was arrested for wearing pants in public, but later set free and returned to Puerto Rico. And sadly, she died at a relatively young age. She contracted tuberculosis and died on October 10th, 1922, October 10th being an important date in Cuban history. And one of the things a quote that I wanted to share is, she writes, and this is obviously a translation, "So we preach and desire a fraternal world should not issue insults nor attempt to dishonor our neighbor, if indeed we are brothers. Otherwise, we will never come to practice fraternity. This does not mean that we should hide the truth. No. Hypocrisy, meanness, any kind of farce must be exposed. Because for the mere fact that we are brothers, we must make others understand that we know our rights, and that if they trample on those rights, we have the right to remind them that we are incensed by the injustice of it." Thank you very much. Don't you dare go out like this.
The main theme of tonight is El Lector. the reader. Important because this is a book fair. This is Tampa's first international book fair. Books are written so that they are read. They are read in order to refresh people's memories, to stimulate, and to inform concerning the subject that the book is about. They have selected the lector as the focal point of tonight's opening event. Emiliano, who was the lector? Did he work for the factory? No. Emiliano, who did the lector get hired by? He certainly was not hired by management. He was hired by the cigar makers. The lector was selected to entertain, to inform, to make them think, and in effect, it was the earliest form of schooling for the cigar makers. Many cigar makers already knew at least how to read and write, but not all knew how to get a book and how to read a paragraph and how to read a chapter and how to understand the message of the author. So who were these people called lectores? They were people just like you and me. They were the tabaqueros. They were the people of the factory. The earliest tabaqueros started in the chinchales, in the small cigar factories in Havana, where they would select, oye María, por favor, da tú la lectura por media hora. When María was done, oye Pepe, lee tú ahora por media hora. Oye José, ven acá, lee tú ahora este periódico. So they would pass the reading material around. After a while, someone said, yo quisiera ser el lector. There was an audition. ¿Quién más quiere competir para ser el lector? Y un pequeño comité, a small selection committee, selected, you're going to be the lector. There was no job security. If somebody else came along and said, oye, yo quisiera que ustedes consideraran que yo fuera el lector, there was always a leader among the cigar makers called el presidente de la lectura. And he had two people working with him. In effect, they would then be the audition or the selection committee. No, este no lee tan bien como aquel. O este lee mucho mejor. So, if all of a sudden somebody came along that was a damn good reader, the poor guy that was there now, oye, se acabó, tenemos otro lector. So as I said, there was no job security. But who selected what he was to read? The tabaqueros were the ones that would contribute voluntarily how much they wanted to give on Saturday, because Saturday at noon was payday. So then they would decide, bueno, vamos a darle una peseta. No, vamos a darle 15 centavos. Oye, qué bien habló, dale 2 pesetas. So, in effect, the lector was the best paid among the employees because he was their employee. He didn't always read what the owners wanted to hear, but the one that selected what was to be read was the voting tabaqueros. Oye, yo quiero que él lea esta traducción. Oye, yo quiero que él lea parte de este periódico que me mandaron de Bejucal. Oye, yo quiero que él lea este periódico que llegó de Madrid. So the tabaqueros would select what was to be read. You've heard that there was internal revolution within the cigar factories because some of the manufacturers objected to some of the liberal or radical readings, but you must understand what was going on in the world at that particular time. The Russian Revolution was going on. The Bolshevik Revolution. There was a lot of anti-monarchy. Many were against the kings and the monarchy this and the monarchy should have done that and they didn't do that. And working conditions. Oye, que estamos trabajando aquí en esta fábrica y nada más que hay un baño. The owner is the one that had to provide the restrooms. So they would approach the owner. You need to add another restroom. Well, isn't one enough? No. There should be one for women. There should be one for men. And then you have factories like Santa Ella in West Tampa with 1,000 employees. There was a lot of bladder movement at the time. So one restroom, or maybe even 2, simply was not enough. We don't want to work any more than Saturday at noon. So the fábrica would produce from early Monday morning through Saturday at noon. And at noon, they would get paid. They not only got paid, but they then would stop at the Presidente de la Lectura desk, and they would give him, esto es para el lector. Esto es para el lector. No, hoy no tengo para darle al lector. So there was a collection by the President of La Lectura, and they would then hand that to the lector. Now, when did La Lectura first come to Tampa? It came right here, 1.5 blocks from where we are today. It was the very first cigar factory of Vicente Martinez Ibor. And he brought his friend from Cayo Hueso, Jose Dolores Pollo, to be the first lector. He even opened a small newspaper here in Ybor City called Eliada. But soon his family was saying, vámonos pa Cayo Hueso otra vez. When he left, Ramon Rivero y Rivero had just gotten elected to city council, and he became the second lector. He had a small newspaper also, El Cuba, and they had bookstores where they would bring in newspapers and magazines, revistas, from Havana, Cuba, or from Spain, besides having the New York Times, the Chicago paper, the New York Sun. So these newspaper agencies here in Ybor City supplied the lector. Who paid for what he read? He had to pay for his own reading material. How about the novels that they read? Did they go to the library and check it out? There was no library. So you had to buy your own reading material. With time, certain traditions occurred. When did the lector start to speak? He always spoke in the morning for 2 hours, and he spoke for 2 hours in the afternoon. The presidente de la lectura traditionally would see him going up to his podium or a chair, and with the campanilla, everything would become silent in la galera, in the gallery, the big area where they were making cigars. So la campanilla was, like I would do in court, order in court. Everything gets quiet. Everything would get quiet, and the first part of la lectura was always newspapers. So the tabaqueros were listening what is happening in Paris, what is happening in Berlin, what is happening in Buenos Aires, what is happening in all the international capitals. Then what is happening in Washington? What is happening in Chicago or Philadelphia or San Francisco? Then local news. What is happening in Jacksonville? What is happening in Key West? Key West, by the way, was the largest city in Florida at the time. Certainly we're all shocked at that, but it's true. The cigar industry had made Cayo Hueso the largest city in Florida. But there were news from Florida that had to be reported, and then what is going on in downtown? What is happening with the election of so-and-so? So there were local news. And then the afternoon would be the reading of the novels. So the morning hour and a half or two was all news. So it was like, remember, there was no radio, there was no television, there were no computers, there were no smartphones. How did you find out what is happening around you and about the world? Newspapers. And newspapers would have many editions. The printer might print 3 special editions in one day because news were happening. That's how you found out. Years ago, centuries ago, there was the town crier. Years ago, when the king would sign an order, he would give it to el pregonero, and the pregonero would have a bell, and he would come to your village or your aldea or your pueblo, ring the bell. Oh, parece que ahí está el pregonero. A ver qué nos dice. Su Majestad el Rey ha dictado, and so on, would give the order. That was the way news used to travel. So the lectores here in Tampa became the broadcasters. No radio, no TV, but they were giving information to the listening public. The noontime came along, he would put away the newspapers, take a quick lunch break, and then come back right after lunch, probably at 1:30, 1:45. The presidente de la lectura is watching, and when he saw that the lector was ready with la novela that he's going to read again. La campanilla, everybody quiet. So this became a standard. Another thing that was a standard was la chaveta. La chaveta was an instrument, an indispensable instrument, because this was the cutting blade to cut the tobacco into form the cigar. Of course, this is a make-believe chaveta made out of wood, but all of the chavetas were metal. And whenever the tabaqueros liked what was being said, they would hit the table like this. And that was the applause. They didn't hit their hands. They took their chavetas, and that was el aplauso por lo que se estaba diciendo. Another thing that was standard there was always cold water in containers with ladles that you could always go and get some water, and the nevero would deliver ice twice a day to keep the water cold. Early on in the factories, there was no running water. There were no water fountains. There was no refrigerated water. But there was fresh water that would be put in containers with the ladles, and you would bring your lata de leche condensada that you kept. You didn't bring a cup, but you did bring the little can of condensed or evaporated milk. You had taken the label off, you had washed it, and this became your drinking cup. You not only drank water, but the cafetero came twice a day. In the morning, the cafetero would show up and he would have two containers, one boiling milk and one espresso coffee. And he would walk up and he already knew, este le gusta oscuro, a este le gusta claro, este no toma leche, este es café solo, espresso. So this was the cup that was used twice a day with the café that the cafetero would bring to the factory. Now, the selection became competitive. Yes, you had to know how to read. You had to know how to express yourself. You had to know how to pause, and if it's a woman that is speaking, speak softly. If it was a man, intone your voice a little stronger so that the tabaquero that's busy making the tobacco could understand, esa es la mujer que está respondiendo ahora. Or there were times where the chapter was a sexy, particularly hot description. The man that's doing the reading knows that everybody is all ears. Did the lover run out the back door? Did the husband catch them? What happened? So the lectores also knew not only that the listening public was the tabaqueros, but in the big windows of the cigar factories, housewives who had already been told by the husband, ahora nos vamos a enterar. Pero tú crees que le pegó los tarros. vamos a enterar. Ah. Así que hoy, sí. So all of a sudden, while the lector is giving his lectura, you could see umbrellas right outside of the window. And they were the housewives who, like the novela of TV, they were anxious to know about that particular scene, that particular moment. So they would be listening. Then those that did not go listen would have to wait for the evening so that the husband would then report. Bueno, cuéntame. En la lectura de hoy, ¿qué pasó? And then the husband would be giving, but then if the daughter was also one of the employees, she would say, no, Papa, déjame yo explicárselo a Mama. And then the daughter would explain what was going on. In any case, the lecturas were very, very popular. And who selected the reading material? The reading material was the cigar makers who learned through word of mouth. There is this novel, there is that novel, there is this sequel to a novel, and they in turn would request. And of course, it was up to the lector to buy the book. And the book may not arrive for a week or 2 or 3, but eventually it would be read. Who were some of our famous lectores that we had here? I've already told you that the very first one was José Dolores Pollo. His great-great-grandson will be speaking during this very conference. His name is Dr. Jerry Pollo, who is a distinguished historian in San Antonio, Texas, and you will be hearing from the great-great-grandson of the first lector. The second was Ramon Rivero y Rivero, who not only had the bookstore, but he's the one that introduced José Martí when José Martí came to speak here for the first time in November. We have an outline for you of the different visits of José Martí. And then the third one that followed was Ramón Rubiera de Armas, who was another revolutionary, and he was a very lucky kid. When he was 16 years old, he had gone on an expeditionary mission to Cuba with a boat called the Virginias. They were captured on the high seas, taken to Santiago de Cuba, and half of those that were in the Virginias, including the captain from Tampa, Captain Joseph Fry, were executed. This 16-year-old kid was about to be executed, but the U.S. Navy intervened. The Spanish government stopped the execution. The American Navy took those that were still there and brought them to New York. Ramón Rubiera de Armas learned a hell of a lesson, and he became an American citizen. But he stayed as a revolutionary in Cuba and in New York, and then moved to Tampa. Then we had another very famous lector in the West Tampa factories by the name of Bonifacio Byrne, B-Y-R-N-E, in Spanish, Berne. And he is the famous Cuban poet who wrote the most beautiful poem about la bandera, la mía, mi bandera. No hace falta dos banderas. Nada más que necesitamos la bandera mía. Él fue lector in West Tampa. She's already mentioned to you the only female that we've been able to document was a lectora here in Tampa, Luisa Capetillo. But then we had a Cuban that got elected in West Tampa to city council, and then became mayor of West Tampa by the name of Francisco Milian. Francisco Milian was working as director in the Bustillo factory, and apparently the tabaqueros wanted to hear more radical newspapers, and he was reading what his employees wanted him to read, and that really got him in trouble, because even though he was the mayor of West Tampa and he was director in Bustillo, he got kidnapped one afternoon, taken to Port Tampa, put on a boat, and said, "Lárguese de aquí, nunca vuelva. If you come back, we will kill you." So Milian had to leave in that steamer. Fortunately, the steamer stopped in Key West. And in Key West, he went to see the sheriff and said, "I was kidnapped. My family is in West Tampa. And look, they have threatened to kill me because I have read some stuff in the factory. I didn't select the stuff. My employers, the cigar makers, are the ones that selected it." Anyway, he came back to Port Tampa to a hero's welcome and got reelected as mayor of West Tampa. And then we had Victoriano Mantega, the founder of La Gaceta. You notice that this lector is reading from La Gaceta. The one that had been a lector before he became the editor of La Gaceta was Victoriano Mantega. He came to Tampa and he went to the audition committee, and they fired whoever they had as the lector, and they hired Victoriano. For 10 years, he was the lector in the Morgan Cigar Factory in West Tampa. And then during one of the strikes, he went to see the doctor that had his offices a block and a half from here, and he asked Dr. Avellanal to help him because he wanted to open up a newspaper. That newspaper was La Gaceta. La Gaceta today is the longest and the oldest Spanish language newspaper in the United States, a trilingual newspaper. And then in your program, you have a lector that's expressing himself. That perhaps was the most famous of the lectores that we had. He was really an actor. He used to produce shows at the Centro Asturiano Theater. He even became the director of the Federal Theater program. His name was Manuel Aparicio. He taught his son, Henry, how to be a lector. Henry went on to the university and became a school teacher, but then they canceled all of the lecturas, and Mr. Aparicio went to New York, and he was in Broadway, Spanish Broadway shows in New York. Then we had Joaquin de la Llana, who always dressed very sharp, and the favorite novel that people used to have de la Llana read was El Conde de Montecristo. So they gave him el apodo. Ese es el Conde. So Joaquin became el Conde to all of the tabaqueros that would listen to him. And then we had the father and two sons. Wilfredo and Mateo were the children of Francisco Rodriguez, known as El Mexicano. I've never been able to figure out why they called him El Mexicano, because he was from Cuba. But you know that in Tampa they gave apodos to everybody. So the father and the two sons were famous, and the famous Fernando Figueredo Socarrás himself, for a short time, was one of the lectores that we had here. We had Manuel de Ulofeu Leonard como uno de los lectores de Tampa. We had a number of them that were deported because they would read too much radical material. Two radical lectores like Pedro Esteve, Carlos Baliño, Cornelio Brito, Enrique Cresci, Francisco Segura, etc. We had one tragedy among the lectores. We used to have Oscar Elias. Oscar Elias was the lector in the Cuesta and Rey factory in West Tampa. And when the lectores were finally kicked out, Mr. Cuesta disassembled the podium where the lectura would take place. And seeing the podium being destroyed, Oscar Elias, the lector of that particular factory, committed suicide that particular day, the 26th of November, 1931. In any case, I've told you that we had many books that were favorite books. Of course, Don Quixote de la Mancha was always a favorite, Los Miserables, Les Miserables. The Letters to a Cuban Mother, written by Victor Hugo during the 10-year war in Cuba. And then you had Don Juan Tenorio, which became so bad, the famous Dreyfus Affair, written by Emilio Zola. Jose Marti's translations, of which he had many, besides his poetry, and besides the speeches that have been mentioned here moments ago, Por Cuba que sufre los pinos nuevos, those were read to the cigar makers. Benito Pérez Galdós, who wrote Episodios Nacionales, was a favorite. Vicente Blasco Ibáñez, Alejandro Dumas, El Conde de Montecristo, Los Tres Mosqueteros, The Man in the Iron Mask, and then La Dama de las Camelias was another very favorite, written by Alejandro Dumas' son, Junior. La Casa de la Troya. All of the tabaqueros knew the sequence of La Casa de la Troya, written by Alejandro Pérez Lujín, and so on. Many foreign and American writers enjoyed the privilege of their books being read. Of course, as has been said, La Lectura was all in Spanish. There were a number of tragedies. I've already told you that one lector was kidnapped. Another one committed suicide. What I did not include was that in the Bustillo factory, where Francisco Milian was the lector, there was a strike, and while the cigar makers were picketing, the bookkeeper, Mr. Easterling, came back to the factory to do his chores, and from somewhere, someone fired a pistol or a rifle hitting Mr. Easterling. Mr. Easterling was seriously injured, but he was in the hospital. But the police in West Tampa arrested two anarchists, Albano and Figarrota, and they were supposedly going to take these two immigrants to the county jail. But there was a vigilante committee that came along, kidnapped the two Italianos, and took them to the corner of what is now Kennedy and Howard. There was a large oak tree, and both Italianos were hung, and no one was ever prosecuted, or the investigation ever determined who kidnapped and killed these two immigrants. I've given you a lot of information about the lectura. I also must tell you that the selection was always not easy. There was one time that two guys were opposed to what was to be read. They had a duel and they shot each other because they were arguing about who was going to be the one that his novel was going to be read. I hope that you've enjoyed an introduction to La Lectura. Remember the bell would ring, remember the cup, remember La Chaveta, and when you receive your chaveta as a souvenir of tonight's event, remember that right during this period is the centennial 100 years ago, the lectura was kicked out of the factories, and that was the end of the education system inside of our factories. Thank you very much.
Order in court.